Hello, sophomores. Sorry I missed you today. Hopefully everything went well, and all is good in the world. Alright, so we're getting into some slavery issues, which, as you may assume, is one of the big reasons the United States goes to the Civil War. Certainly it's about politics, namely, but a lot of these politics revolve around slavery. So, what are those politics of slavery? That is a lovely question. And it all kind of stems from the expansion of slavery. As we've mentioned, we have the cotton gin, which is allowing planters to harvest more crops, make more money. And New England, with all their factories, there's a large market for it. So it isn't just like the South or these farmers are producing cotton with no one to buy it. New England is buying massive quantities of cotton to produce into textiles. These mills are only located in the South because that's the only place where there are rivers strong enough to power the mills. So there begins to start kind of a big disparity between the North and the South. The North being quite industrialized, the South just really expanding its agriculture. And with the expansion of agriculture and the profit growing for producing cotton, the Southerners really start to defend slavery. For a while before the cotton gin, many Southerners were in pretty support of abolition, of the ending of slavery. However, in 1831, there's what's known as the Nat Turner Rebellion. And in the Nat Turner Rebellion, 80 slaves kill 60 men, women, and children. So that really turns many Southerners off from abolition number one, starts them imposing stricter laws, and Southerners start to see slavery, or continue to see slavery as it's essential for the economy in the region, and that it's, as the Vice President of the United States said, a positive good, that it is something that's really good for the slaves, that it gives them structure and improves their lives. So what might have ended really starts to expand. We have auction houses, the economics of slavery expanding, and with that expansion there becomes more criticism. And what starts to spread is abolitionism, this belief that slaves should be free. So by the early 1800s, the North has abolished slavery. Massachusetts and New Hampshire were the first ones. They abolished slavery in 1783. And in 1807, the international slave trade is abolished, which means while there are still slaves in the United States, it is illegal to bring slaves from Africa. So the slave trade that exists in the United States are slaves who are already in the U.S. or slaves who are born into slavery. And in 1807, Britain, as a country, outlaws slavery. And Britain doesn't just outlaw slavery. About 30 years later, they establish what's known as the Anti-Slavery Naval Fleet. And the British are so opposed to slavery that they want to eliminate it worldwide. So even though there are illegal ships carrying slaves from Africa to the United States, the British start actively seizing them and returning them to Africa. So this real inspiration from England spurs a lot of Americans, especially in the North, to say, well, we need to do the same thing. And this causes people to really speak out. And some ways that they do this is these are images of slave children in New Orleans. And Northerners who might not be as supportive of ending slavery, images like this would encourage them. These children are mixed race, so they look white, which even people that perhaps are racist themselves, they could say, well, even white people are enslaved. But in reality, most slaves are of this skin tone, as you might say, of much more African descent. Not that the children in the previous image were not, but those were not the norm for what slaves look like. So this conflict between the North and the South, ideologies, it really starts to divide the country. And as the country is expanding, we've mentioned before that the states, number of states, they tried to be equal, of free states and slave states. So that maintains equality in the Senate, where there's 2 representatives from every state. But the North is gaining a big advantage in the House, because the House is dependent on population. And while the South is certainly expanding slave states, the population isn't growing a whole lot. And the biggest growth in their population are slaves. And slaves, if you recall, only count for 3/5 of a person when it comes to representation in the House. So the South is getting worried that the North is gaining more power politically. Now, we've mentioned the Missouri Compromise, where Maine is established. And what it establishes is this line. If you look at the line on the map here, it's the 3630 line. So slavery is prohibited then above this line after the Missouri Compromise allows Missourian, and it is allowed below the line. Now, if you draw that line all the way across to the ocean, as you can see, most of the United States will be then, well, free. And this, of course, does not make the Southerners happy, as they would like slavery to expand northward of this line. So another compromise is needed, and this is what's known as the Compromise of 1850. And it's really looking at these states, many of which are added after the Mexican-American War, of what's going to happen to those states in regards to slavery. And initially there's a man, his name is David Wilmont, this is him right here, and he proposes something known as the Wilmont Proviso, that all of the land that's been won through the Mexican-American War will be free states, in return for the Mexican-American War being funded with about $2 million. So he's saying, as long as we're fighting for this war, we should use it as a chance to ban slavery in this area. Sadly for him and abolitionists, his plan does not succeed, and what then happens is the Compromise of 1850. And Compromise of 1850 has a few parts. Firstly, California is admitted as a free state. If you look at the map here, the red states are free. California is admitted as a free state. Secondly, the slave trade was abolished in D.C. So in the District of Columbia, the nation's capital, slave trade is abolished. Not slavery itself, but the trade of slaves. And then there's 2 states, Utah and New Mexico, which are determined that they will be organized under popular sovereignty. And what popular sovereignty means is that states are going to be allowed, the citizens of them, are going to be allowed to vote on whether they want slavery or not. And while this initially is just looking at Utah and New Mexico, later on gets put into place, especially for our concerns in Kansas. And as you can imagine, since voters are voting on a very divisive issue when it comes to should there be slavery or not, there's going to be some conflict. But we won't get into that right now. And the final part of the Compromise of 1850 is something called the Fugitive Slave Act. And Fugitive Slave Act is really meant to pass stricter laws that are going to return escaped slaves to the South and to their owners. And this angers many Northerners. This poster here is warning especially freed slaves in Boston that there's going to be these slave catchers that are supported by the United States government. So they aren't just hired thugs, they are going to be assisted by the United States Marshals. And the presence of this Fugitive Slave Act is really something that angers a lot of people. While the Underground Railroad was happening, there's hundreds of slaves that are escaping the South. And now, even if they had been freed years before, there's potential that they could be returned to their owners in the South. All right, so here's some issues that have caused concern in the United States, and that we're going to continue looking at as we move forward.